My wife has an admirable habit of morning runs. One day, returning home ravenous after her exercise, she hastily raided the refrigerator for a quick snack. Almost instantly, she was struck by an agonizing abdominal pain. Her desperate cries for help sounded as though the sky were collapsing. Terrified, I threw her into the car and raced to the nearest urgent care clinic. The moment the wheels stopped moving, she literally rolled out of the passenger door, forcing me to leap out, leave the engine idling and the car unlocked, and scoop her up to carry her inside. At the reception desk, she wept openly, crying out that she was dying. The doctors and nurses, intimately familiar with such high-stakes drama, remained entirely unfazed. With practiced routine, they wheeled her into an examination room and ordered a flurry of scans and blood tests. When the reports finally came back, the doctor offered a comforting verdict. There was no organic failure whatsoever. They hooked her up to a standard saline and painkiller drip. She was technically fit for discharge that very afternoon, but given the sheer intensity of her distress, the hospital kept her overnight for observation. She was discharged the following morning. Her acute affliction, it turned out, was entirely transient, the predictable rebellion of a heated digestive tract subjected to sudden, icy sustenance. It required no heavy-handed intervention, yet the ordeal profoundly reinforced a core tenet of my own academic outlook. When confronted with vivid symptoms, one must never rush to prescribe a cure before unearthing the root cause. Sometimes, the most alarming crises are merely temporary spasms, and the organism is perfectly capable of mending itself. When confronted with a patient writhing in agony, a competent clinician seeks the underlying pathology before brandishing the syringe. In macroeconomics, however, such diagnostic rigor is frequently discarded in favor of immediate, flashy therapeutics. Observing Japan's prolonged economic stagnation from his perch at the Nomura Research Institute, Richard C. Koo correctly identified a fascinating behavioral shift: a corporate universe that had abandoned the traditional pursuit of profit maximization in favor of debt minimization. To describe this frantic scramble to repair corporate ledgers, he coined a brilliant, evocative phrase, the balance sheet recession, and elevated a mere ledger book symptom to the status of a primary disease. Having misdiagnosed the accounting reflection as the pathogen, Mr. Koo proceeded with commendable audacity to prescribe a ferocious remedy. If the private sector refused to borrow and spend, he argued, the state must step into the breach, borrowing heavily to substitute for comatose private investment and reticent consumer demand. This is the macroeconomic equivalent of treating a severe chill by throwing the patient into a furnace. It calls to mind the medical charlatans of Molière's comedies, whose diagnostic lexicon was limited to a single page, and whose universal solution to any ailment, be it a broken heart or a broken leg, was immediate, aggressive bloodletting. Mr. Koo similarly skips the tedious diagnostic phase altogether, prescribing aggressive fiscal chemotherapy without ever bothering to look at the biopsy. To understand Japan's lost decades, one must look beneath the surface ink of corporate balance sheets and peer into the ossified skeletal structure of its political economy. The true locus of Japan's economic malaise is not a technical accounting anomaly, but rather the deeply entrenched regime of Daimyo capitalism. This brand of state-directed capitalism, characterized by an incestuous collusion between corporate titans and political mandarins, has effectively institutionalized a web of stifling regulations. Without dismantling this primary tumor, where capital and state power are inextricably entwined, the market cannot breathe. The chronic afflictions of a heavily managed economy cannot be cured. Without liberating the market from the shackles of this administrative guidance, any talk of a true Japanese Renaissance remains a mirage. Economics, like any genuine science, must adhere to a fundamental axiom. Successful treatment requires an accurate diagnosis of the root cause, not a cosmetic suppression of the symptoms. One must prescribe medicine for the pathology itself, not the fever it generates. To be sure, human rationality is frustratingly finite. Even when economists correctly identify a disease, they remain perfectly capable of botched surgeries and toxic prescriptions. But what we witness far more frequently in the halls of global policymaking is a more terrifying display of hubris, an unshakable willingness to administer highly volatile, systemic drugs without having the faintest inkling of what is actually wrong with the patient.
Man, I got two questions for you. What do you do and how do you do it?
I'm a stockbroker.
Stockbroker? Oh, had to go to college to be a stockbroker, huh?
You don't have to. Have to be good with numbers and good with people. That's it.
Hey, you take care.
Still remember that moment. They all looked so damn happy to me. Why couldn't I look like that?
The Industrial Revolution served as the great engine of global economic divergence. Since the Second World War, developing economies, most notably in Latin America, have sprinted to catch up with the West, only to find the relative gap between the two sides has grown wider and wider. This is the visible symptom. But if we are to prescribe a cure that actually aids these lagging nations, we must first dissect the underlying cause. Enter Raul Prebisch and Celso Montero Furtado. While serving at the Economic Commission for Latin America, the Argentine and Brazilian economists conceived what is now known as structuralist economics. Prebisch and Furtado argued that the global economy had ossified into an asymmetric binary hierarchy, an industrial center and a commodity-dependent periphery. In their eyes, the classic market price mechanism was not a neutral arbiter of value, but a rigged game. In their view, the fatal symptom of this structural disease manifested in the global marketplace as a secular decline in the terms of trade. For Prebisch and Furtado, this structural imbalance was the true root cause of Latin America's perpetual failure to catch up. The patient was not merely lazy or undisciplined. The international bloodstream was systematically draining wealth from the periphery to the center. Long before Latin American structuralists gave this phenomenon a polished academic veneer, the Marxist left had already spotted the trap. In April 1923, at the 12th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, Leon Trotsky looked at the divergence between expensive industrial goods and cheap agricultural products and saw a pair of opening shears. He called it the price scissors. Trotsky warned that if the blades kept widening, the fragile alliance between the industrial proletariat and the peasantry would snap. Fast forward to May 2005. The setting shifted from early Soviet Moscow to a textile supply chain forum in Beijing. China's then Commerce Minister, Bo Xilai, vividly updated Trotsky's anatomy of unequal exchange for the globalized era.
China needs to export 800 million shirts just to buy one Airbus A380.
The basic pathology had not changed in 80 years. The blades had simply shifted from wheat versus tractors to garments versus aviation. With the pathogen allegedly identified, the structuralists confidently drafted their prescription. To escape the trap of the periphery, developing states decided they could not afford the luxury of waiting for a free market to mature. They launched an all-out assault on the price mechanism through a highly aggressive policy toolkit. Developing countries must keep foreign industrial goods out by imposing high tariffs and trade barriers. The government must take direct control of core resources such as finance and foreign exchange, and by establishing state-owned enterprises, directly intervening in prices, and forcibly distorting factor prices, it must concentrate the nation's resources on heavy industry. By forcing national resources into heavy industry, these regimes attempted to defy gravity. They built steel mills, chemical plants, and automotive factories by sheer administrative decree. But as we shall see, by completely blinding the market's pricing eyes, they also guaranteed that these new industries would grow up blind, fragile, and utterly dependent on state life support. The quest for the road to prosperity eventually devolved into a multifactional scholastic brawl, drawing in nearly every major school of economic thought. By the 1970s, a rising chorus of neoliberals offered a devastating second opinion. The primary pathogen afflicting the developing world was not a failure of the market, but the very remedy prescribed by the Structuralists. In the neoliberal view, the aggressive state intervention meant to save the periphery had instead delivered a plague of bloated monopoly state enterprises. Shielded from the bracing winds of competition, these bureaucratic monoliths operated with staggering inefficiency, functioning less as engines of growth and more as permanent wards of the state, draining fiscal resources via endless subsidies. Worse still, comprehensive state controls over prices, interest rates, and foreign exchange achieved little more than the institutionalization of corruption, turning economic policy into a playground for rent-seeking apparatchiks. To feed these voracious state-owned white elephants and sustain profligate welfare spending, governments inevitably swallowed the exact economic poison that Mr. Ku would later propose for Japan. Positioning the state as the borrower of last resort, regimes piled up mountainous debts. When the bond markets balked, governments turned to the printing press to plug the fiscal abyss, predictably triggering hyperinflation and systemic collapse. The ultimate catastrophic manifestation of this misdiagnosis arrived on cue, the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. During the 1970s, awash in a deluge of recycled petrodollars, Latin American regimes embarked on a precarious strategy of debt-led growth. Seduced by deceptively low real interest rates, they borrowed hand over fist to finance domestic industrialization. Consequently, between 1970 and 1980, the region's collective external ledger exploded from a manageable $27 billion to a staggering $231 billion. Yet decades of loose global monetary policy, combined with the structural shock of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, eventually brought America face to face with a 10% inflation monster. Enter Paul Volcker. In March 1980, the famously cigar-chomping Federal Reserve Chairman unleashed a monetary sledgehammer, ratcheting the federal funds rate from 10.25% to an unprecedented 20%. As international benchmark rates surged in tandem, the interest payments on Latin America's floating-rate debts spiked overnight. As the world's undisputed economic heavyweight, whenever America catches a cold, the rest of the world is forced to swallow the medicine. The soaring greenback promptly sent global commodity prices into a 30% tailspin. For the commodity-dependent peripheries of Latin America, export revenues evaporated almost instantly, leaving them entirely bankrupt and utterly unable to service their mountainous debts. In August 1982, the financial dam burst. Mexico became the first to declare that it could no longer service its foreign debts, formally raising the curtain on the Latin American debt crisis. The financial dominoes tumbled at terrifying speed. The region's economic heavyweights, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Peru, and Chile, were swiftly dragged into the vortex, one after another announcing a freeze or delay on their repayments. National currencies went into a free-fall, catapulting countries like Argentina and Brazil into a hyperinflationary stratosphere where prices soared by hundreds and occasionally thousands of percent. Desperate and bankrupt, Latin American nations had no choice but to beg the IMF and the World Bank for a financial lifeline. But this Western rescue came with draconian strings attached, which were summarized as the Washington Consensus by British economist John Williamson in 1989. This package served as America's neoliberal economic blueprint to reshape the economies of Latin America. It forced besieged governments to swallow a bitter regime of aggressive fiscal austerity and wholesale privatization of state enterprises. While this shock therapy gradually untangled the debt knot, it left a toxic legacy of severe wealth inequality and explosive social unrest. This era of continent-wide devastation earned its definitive name in economic history, La Década Perdida, the lost decade.
Are you ready?
What are you going to do?
We're going to saw off your leg.
Why?
Because you have a fever.
You're going to saw off my leg just because I have a fever?
Yes, it's our family's secret remedy. Sawing off a leg cures all illnesses.
In practice, regardless of the unique pathology afflicting a developing nation, the neoliberal physicians invariably prescribed the exact same ancestral panacea: shock therapy, with wholesale privatization as its crowning ingredient. This ideological snake oil was marketed as a universal cure-all to be swallowed whole and without complaint by every unfortunate patient on the periphery. Yet the high priests of the free market conveniently ignored a damning contradiction closer to home. The ruinous American inflation of the late 1970s was not the fault of under-regulated markets, but the direct consequence of the Federal Reserve's blind faith in the Keynesian Phillips curve. Seduced by the illusion that they could permanently buy low unemployment at the cost of modest inflation, central bankers ran the printing presses ragged, driving monetary aggregates, M1 and M2, to dizzying heights. The ultimate irony remains that the United States, the very cradle of this neoliberal gospel, never once practiced the unadulterated free market capitalism it so aggressively exported. Washington routinely manipulated interest rates and ladled out gargantuan subsidies to its own domestic industries, most notoriously to its agricultural sector. The result was a masterclass in asymmetrical economic warfare, a monetary black blizzard engineered in the sterile boardrooms of North America that swept south to devastate Latin America, leaving the developing world to pay the price for Washington's own policy sins. When defending the legacy of shock therapy, neoliberals embrace a cold teleological cynicism. They point triumphantly to the destination while ignoring the body count along the road. True, the nations subjected to this economic blitzkrieg eventually emerged into the light of market capitalism, but the transition itself was nothing short of catastrophic. From the ruins of the Soviet Union to the fractured societies of Latin America, privatization was less a textbook transition and more a chaotic feeding frenzy, where national wealth was swallowed whole by emerging oligarchs. In its wake, life expectancy plummeted, and the very fabric of civil society was ground into dust. Survival is not a validation of the prescription. That the patient did not expire on the operating table does not make the quack a brilliant surgeon. The high priests of neoliberalism have spent decades claiming credit for a recovery that was never theirs to claim, mistaking the natural resilience of human societies for the efficacy of their own treatment. We cannot pronounce a disaster successful simply because humanity managed to survive it. It is rather like a patient presenting with a high fever, only for an ivory tower scholar to amputate both legs. When the poor soul eventually crawls out of ICU, these impeccably suited neoliberals proudly declare, "See, had we not severed the limbs, how on earth would the fever have broken?" It is time to pose the uncomfortable question. Did shock therapy cure the ailment, or did the stubborn vitality of these nations manage to overcome both the original economic malaise and the secondary trauma inflicted by the cure itself. Was there not a saner, more measured road to prosperity, one that did not require the wholesale sacrifice of a generation?
从16世纪、17世纪，当时英国在追赶那时候世界最发达的国家荷兰开始，那么到了呢19世纪中叶，美国、德国、法国在追赶英国，还有2次世界大战以后的日本、亚洲四条小龙在追赶美国在快速发展的时候，都使用了产业政策。那么不仅是说处于追赶阶段的国家，他们的政府有产业政策。现在美国在国际上领先的这些产业或是这些企业，他们早期的研发基本上都是政府支持的。
Identical symptoms can stem from entirely different pathologies. Misdiagnose the etiology, and the doctor's prescription will inevitably turn lethal. Justin Yifu Lin turned his scalpel upon his predecessors, arguing that old structuralism suffered from two fatal self-inflicted wounds. First, a violent defiance of comparative advantage. The old economic doctors forced capital-starved, labor-abundant nations to jump straight into the deep end of heavy industry. This policy effectively demanded that a patient with the frail constitution of a peasant lift the weights of an Olympic athlete. In a free, competitive market, these enterprises possessed zero inherent viability. Lacking the muscle to survive on their own, these corporate white elephants had to be placed in a permanent economic intensive care unit, hooked up to a continuous state drip of subsidies and financial blood transfusions just to keep their hearts beating. Second, it fatally corrupted the economic bloodstream. To protect these artificial, delicate giants from collapsing, the state could no longer allow a fair or transparent game. Governments were forced to warp the entire financial ecosystem, rigging interest rates, manipulating exchange rates, and enforcing sweeping administrative monopolies. This heavy-handed intervention achieved two disastrous results. It suffocated the organic vitality of the private sector, which was starved of economic oxygen, and it turned bureaucrats into omnipotent gatekeepers. The diagnostic verdict. When wealth is secured through political rent-seeking rather than market competition, entrepreneurship dies. In its place, systemic corruption and a monumental waste of scarce resources inevitably fester. Justin Yifu Lin is not merely a critic of old statist quackery. He is equally contemptuous of the neoliberal fundamentalists of the Chicago School. In his diagnostic manual, development economics has evolved through a flawed lineage. Old structuralism was the naive first generation. Neoliberalism was the heartless second. His own brainchild, New Structural Economics, stakes its claim as the enlightened third. Lin's central thesis shifts the blame from global conspiracies to domestic anatomy. In his view, an economy's industrial structure is not a wardrobe choice to be selected from a Western catalog. It is an endogenous variable dictated entirely by its factor endowments, the relative abundance of land, labor, and capital it inherits at birth. To expect a capital-starved nation to successfully run a semiconductor megafactory is akin to demanding that a newborn sprint before it can crawl. Strip away the academic jargon, and Lin's therapy boils down to a pragmatic playground rule. Play to your strengths and hide your weaknesses. Undressed of its heavy academic armor, Lin's diagnosis offers a pragmatic pivot. Different patients require different prescriptions. This nuanced approach moves past the rigid dogma of both structuralism and neoliberalism, which had spent decades reductionistically obsessing over the price scissors. Lin's central insight is that every economy possesses a unique set of constraints and capabilities. At any given stage of development, a country's relative abundance of land, labor, or capital, its factor endowments, determines its natural competitive edge. The golden rule, therefore, is simpler than any grand ideology. Play to your strengths. A developing nation must identify the sectors where it already holds a competitive advantage and focus its energies on unlocking that latent capacity. Industrial upgrading cannot be brute forced through the central planning of heavy industry. Instead, a nation must first accumulate profits by trading on its existing comparative advantages. As these earnings accumulate, the country's underlying factor endowment shifts. Capital transforms from a scarce luxury into a plentiful commodity. This organically earned wealth can then fund the transition from lower-tier manufacturing to high-tech clusters, laying the groundwork for a broader economic transformation. To achieve this, new structural economics discards the old binary debate between state and market, proposing instead a complementary double act. An efficient market. The economy must rely on a robust price mechanism and fierce market competition to accurately signal the true scarcity of resources. This commercial reality ensures that profit-seeking entrepreneurs naturally gravitate toward sectors aligned with the nation's comparative advantage. A facilitating state. Industrial upgrading demands more than just entrepreneurial grit. It requires a vast web of supportive infrastructure, from power grids and ports to legal frameworks and financial systems. Because a lone enterprise cannot internalize these massive externalities or solve coordination failures on its own, the state must step in. By using targeted industrial policies or carving out special economic zones, governments can correct market failures and guide the economy toward its next developmental rung. When surveying the wealth of nations, development economists are confronted with a singular chronic malady. Why do developing economies not only fail to catch up with the West, but frequently find themselves trapped in a widening scissors gap of relative divergence? Confronted by the same patient, 3 rival medical schools have diagnosed entirely different etiologies and, naturally, prescribed contradictory cures. The old structuralists argued that the patient suffered from terminal market failure. In their view, price mechanisms in underdeveloped nations were too broken to guide industrialization. Their prescription closely mirrored Richard Kuh's concept of Daimyo capitalism, a state-backed corporate regime where the government acts as a feudal lord, utilizing central planning and heavy-handed subsidies to forcefully drag the nation into the industrial age. The neoliberals, by contrast, diagnosed the cure as the disease itself. To the Chicago school, the very existence of this daimyo capitalism, the incestuous embrace between state power and private monopolies, was the sole cause of retardation. Their therapy was as swift as it was brutal, a regime of shock therapy designed to butcher the state apparatus and enforce wholesale privatization. Justin Yifu Lin's New Structural Economics offers a third, alternative diagnosis. Lin argues that the trauma was caused by political hubris, an undifferentiated meddling where governments blindly pursued a big push toward heavy industries, completely ignoring their own comparative advantage. This forced birth produced corporate heavyweights with zero inherent viability, plunging the economy into structural paralysis. Lin's remedy is neither total state control nor complete state withdrawal, but a pivot from an all-encompassing manager to an agile, facilitating state capable of surgical intervention. The government's primary duty is to safeguard a competitive market where prices are dictated strictly by supply and demand. Only when prices accurately reflect the true scarcity of factors, revealing that labor is cheap and capital is dear, will profit-seeking entrepreneurs organically invest in industries where the nation holds a genuine competitive edge. There is a delicious historical irony buried at the heart of modern Chinese economics: the dual-track system. The very transitional engine that Justin Yifu Lin credits for China's economic miracle was pioneered by none other than his arch-rival, Zhang Weiying. In September 1984, as China prepared to push its economic reforms from the countryside into the cities, mid-career thinkers converged upon Mount Mogan in Duqing County, Zhejiang Province. Their mission was to forge a theoretical blueprint for urban reform, a minefield fraught with sharp ideological divides over price deregulation and enterprise autonomy. It was here, at the landmark National Conference of Young Economic Scholars, that Zhang Weiying presented his seminal paper, Centering Reform on the Price System to Drive the Transformation of the Entire Economic Structure. In this trailblazing text, one that would quietly alter the course of modern China, Zhang became the first to explicitly propose the visionary concept of the dual-track price system. This visionary concept was swiftly absorbed by the third plenary session of the 12th Central Committee of the CPC in October 1984, leaving an indelible imprint on the trajectory of Chinese economic reform. By insulating China from the catastrophic output collapses and hyperinflation that accompanied the post-Soviet shock therapy in Eastern Europe, Zhang's dual-track framework earned its place as an object of enduring scholarly debate. Zhang Weiying's dual-track logic was elegantly simple. The planned track: provide necessary, temporary protection and financial lifelines to legacy, capital-intensive state sectors to avert mass unemployment and social unrest. The market track: completely liberalize private enterprise, dynamic light industries, and foreign investment, allowing them to scale organically based on comparative advantage. As time wore on, the market track expanded exponentially, quietly steering China away from a command economy toward a planned market mechanism. This transition fueled decades of astonishing growth, elevating the nation into a pillar of the global economy. Painful as the adjustment was at times, it spared the country a systemic economic heart attack. Observing this remarkable triumph, Lin seized upon it as the anchor for his own intellectual architecture. On June 2, 2009, marking his first anniversary as Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank, Lin delivered a landmark address at the bank's Senior Economics Seminar titled New Structural Economics, a Framework for Rethinking Development. It was on this global stage that he formally unveiled his third generation of development economics. If both men share the same intellectual ancestry in the dual-track system, one might casually assume they have arrived, by different routes, at a comfortable consensus. Yet beneath this surface harmony lies a profound ideological canyon. What then is the true nature of their schism? How does Zhang Weiying, armed with the radical, uncompromising doctrines of the Austrian school, diagnose the wealth of nations? And what counter-prescription does he write for the road to prosperity? The clinical chart is open, but the final verdict remains fiercely contested. We welcome your insights in the commentary section below.
What are your thoughts on the Moganshan legacy? Was the dual-track system a permanent blueprint or a temporary bridge? Is the state a vital coordinator of economic growth, or is it merely a chronic complication? Drop your insights in the comments below. To ensure you don't miss our ringside seat to this clash of economic titans, hit that subscribe button. We will unpack Zhang Weiying's counterattack in the next chapter.
我们今天在讨论经济增长的时候，我们仍然是用的一个错误的框架。我们认为增长的源泉在哪儿？在于消费，在于投资。然后我们怎么刺激消费，怎么刺激投资？我觉得这个其实都是不对的。中国过去40年的历史证明，经济增长的真正源泉就是企业家精神的发挥，就是人的想象力、人的创造力的发挥。但是什么样的机制下，这种想象力、这种创造力能发挥出来？